Welcome everyone to the series that's going to kill my channel, but before I get into it, I just want to quickly go over what to expect from this video. I'm going to be covering all major versions as thoroughly as I can without repeating points. The list includes the NES, PS1, Game Boy Advance, and the PSP version, with a light sprinkling of WonderSwan to season. There are some iterations which either don't change much or are heavily inaccessible, and I won't talk about them for obvious reasons. These videos also aren't comprehensive, I just talk about shit that I find interesting, and that's it. Thanks. Final Fantasy was released in Japan for the Famicom in December of 1987, and alongside this fact sits an oft-repeated rumour about the developer Square. It's quite vague, but it goes something like this. Square were on the verge of bankruptcy, so they borrowed some ideas from Dragon Quest and staked their ultimate attempt at success on a passion project called Final Fantasy. This appears to be romanticised beyond belief, and while parts are true, it seems largely exaggerated or misinterpreted. Hironobu Sakaguchi, the father of Final Fantasy, makes this clear in an interview. He states, "The name Final Fantasy was a display of my feeling that if this didn't sell well, I was going to quit the games industry and go back to university. I'd have had to repeat a year, so I wouldn't have had any friends. It really was a final situation." So it may not have been the final solution for Square as a company, it seemed like more of an ultimatum for a regretful university dropout who lacked faith in his own team, and ultimately, his own creations. Nobuo Uematsu, that's so awkward in English,
Nobuo Uematsu
has stated that Square was bordering on bankruptcy, but given Sakaguchi's contradictory words, it's tough to say either way. I'm more inclined to believe Sakaguchi, as he was higher up at the time and would have had a better understanding of the internal workings, but there's always the chance that he's just rocking a mad poker face. While the rumour is likely a misinterpretation, the end result may have been the same, and we're incredibly lucky that Final Fantasy exists at all. Interestingly, based on what info I could find about the Square of the mid-80s, they seem to be doing just fine. With an employee count of at least 25 and a few decent years of PC development behind them, what prompted the creation of Final Fantasy may not have been a dire financial situation, but a combination of both the shift in the home console market as well as an internal restructuring of the company. Prior to the development of our beloved series, Square had just established itself as an independent entity breaking from its former parent company. Some changes came along with this, primarily the introduction of a pitch process, where the bigger players would present their concepts in a company-wide meeting, and the employees would voluntarily sort themselves into development teams. When Sakaguchi pitched Final Fantasy, only 3 people initially stepped up to join him, while other groups reportedly contained around 20. Blaming himself and his reputation as a guy who couldn't sell a game, he took responsibility and recruited 2 extras, Koichi Ishii and Akitoshi Kawazu, future creators of the Mana and Saga series respectively. The team wasn't quite complete, however. We're still missing a very important man who goes by the name Nasir Gebelli, or simply Nasir. His story isn't particularly relevant to this video, but his contributions definitely are. Nasir was a developer for many popular Apple II titles, recruited by sheer luck to work for Square in the late 80s, and somehow found himself the final addition to the Fantasy team as a programmer, despite not knowing what an RPG was or even what hit points were. Yoshitaka Amano was also hired as an external concept artist, but from what I've read, had nothing to do with translating the designs to the constraints of the system, and only contributed a percentage of the overall concept art, with the rest being completed by the team. It wasn't entirely an uphill battle, however, as the cultural monolith known as Dragon Quest released in March of 1986, well over a year and a half before Final Fantasy. Square effectively had the benefit of scoping out a title which would define a genre for decades to come before diving in themselves, which no doubt helped immensely. This is evidenced in an interview with Kazuko Shibuya, one of the visual designers for the original Final Fantasy, in which she states that she believed it to be a response to the impact of Dragon Quest. Sakaguchi had reportedly pitched Final Fantasy prior to Dragon Quest becoming a massive hit, and was knocked back, so it all seems to line up pretty well. It also would have begun development around the release of Dragon Quest II, meaning the Square Squad effectively had both games as a reference. Final Fantasy would benefit from this, as a large focus of its creation was in making a concerted effort to be different, in Sakaguchi's own translated words. Not only did the Chad Dragon Quest pave the way for the Virgin Final Fantasy, but was instrumental in its formation for many reasons. So let's recap. Final Fantasy for the Famicom, made in less than a year primarily by a core team of 7 people, consisting of 6 Square employees and a foreign programmer who didn't know what an RPG was. Using Dragon Quest as a reference and taking an active approach to being different, Sakaguchi's team was facing even more constraints than the already limited hardware. As a result of this, Final Fantasy is an absolute fucking mess, but what an impressive mess it is. One thing I've always adored about the original title is the absence of narrative bloat. Generally, when you start an RPG, you've got to put anywhere from 10 minutes to an hour aside before you get to play the fucking thing, and occasionally a lot more, but the beauty of older titles is that they didn't have the resources to blow on flashy cutscenes or a chunky dose of front-loaded exposition. Final Fantasy benefits heavily from this, starting off modest but strong. After a brief text crawl about some heroes and their orbs, you create a party and get dumped on a map with no items, no equipment, and a dream. And also like $400. The lack of intrusive handholding is fantastic, and it doesn't stop there. The entire story consists of 2 cutscenes, a creepy circle jerk of old blokes, and about 10 to 20 mandatory events. A couple of these are disconnected from the core plot, but through weird JRPG logic, they're not too out of place. There's a quest in which you have to collect a crown for a king, but the king's actually an evil elf demon, so you give him a slap and he drops a glass eye, which you take to a witch to wake up a sleeping elf prince who gives you a special key. Said key opens the door to a bunch of dynamite stashed behind a castle, which a dwarf will use to blow a sailable hole through a stretch of land, granting you access to the world at large. I don't know, it made sense to me. The auxiliary story isn't too important and largely exists to gate players with somewhat interesting events, but it'd be silly to pretend that it's not complete batshit. Speaking of which, I much prefer when the plot takes a back seat and we're treated to more subtle scenarios that contribute to world building. In one village, an NPC mentions 5 heroes who went to fight the main antagonist and were turned into bats. As you have a little run-in with this fiend at the start of the game, you're treated to a glimpse at his throne room, which does in fact contain 5 bats. Upon his initial defeat, the party assumes that he's dead, but the fluttering former heroes remain, which heavily alludes to the fact that he didn't die, something the party will discover much later on. It also hints that you weren't the first group of heroes to set out after this guy, and that he'd been causing issues for more than just the kingdom who conscripted the Warriors of Light. Smaller details like this are the unsung heroes of video game stories. Because of their minute presence and the accompanying requirement to read a little deeper without any definitive declaration, they remain underappreciated. That said, what little meat exists on the narrative bone's pretty solid too, particularly for an NES title. The game opens with a king requesting that a stray group of heroes rescue his daughter from a man named Garland. This only takes about 5 minutes, and the following chunk is more of an exploratory endeavour than meaningful narrative progression. However, it's not too long before you start to unearth the core plot, which is of 4 fiends who are slowly sapping the earth of its natural resources through the power of crystals. God, that sounds familiar. For the next 30 years. Each fiend corresponds to an element. Lich killed the earth, Tiamat yeeted the wind, Kraken put fluoride in the water, and the fire one probably did something too. Upon their defeat, your JO crystals will begin to charge, and once they're at bursting point, the party's thrust back in time. So you go through this massive dungeon, refighting the fiends who are much stronger than their initial encounter, only to stumble into the final room. And who should be waiting for you? None other than the very same Garland you dispatched at the beginning of the game. Upon his supposed defeat, he was sent back in time by the fiends, who were then sent forward to the present by Garland, creating an eternal time loop. Obviously, the minute details are a bit rough, such as why the fiends are significantly weaker in the present, and how they still exist in the past, despite supposedly being sent forward. And look, there might even be answers, but it doesn't matter, because they're all being manipulated by Chaos, who you kill and end the time loop. Then the timeline resets, sans evildoers, and the world's saved with nobody remembering a single thing about the entire process. It's a poetic ending, to say the least, but if I were to change one thing, it'd be turning Chaos into more of a concept than a physical being, which would keep the time loop intact. This would effectively mean that the heroes have no real way of winning, but also that Garland is doomed to fail endlessly, and would exist as a representation of the never-ending struggle between good and evil. It would also explain why you're dropped on a map with no point of origin at the beginning of the game, because you've come from the past to repeat the cycle over again. But that's enough about my shitty fanfic. Let's talk about the user interface. The implementation of text boxes might seem rudimentary, but they're so non-intrusive that I wish modern RPGs would go back to them. You press A once and you're given a single blob of text in a lone box. Press A again and you're back to adventuring. Modern stories have become a lot more complex, so they require more exposition, and the addition of voice acting and character animations require slower paced dialogue to match, but I love how they're done here. Final Fantasy might honestly be the first game in which I spoke with every NPC, because I knew I wouldn't have to spend the next 5 minutes mashing through whatever inane shit they had to say. As a result, I wasn't bogged down in vague progression requirements, because I had a torrent of easily accessible information which did a passable job at guidance. Some of the hints were a bit loose, but with a bit of brain power, you can look up a walkthrough. The minimal bloat is unfortunately not widespread, and this is clearly seen whenever you go shopping, as items can only be purchased one at a time. With an inventory limit of 99 and a heavy requirement for non-magic healing, this is immensely tedious. Equipment suffers a similar fate, where no information is given before purchase, and the equip screen doesn't detail stat changes. As equipment is stored in its own little segregated inventory, the limited armor slots require you to juggle gear as you bounce back and forth between the purchase, equip, and status screens just to see if the new shit you bought was even worth it. The game manual does detail a bit of this info, and I'm not sure how accurate it is, but all critical information should be easily accessible within the software. Otherwise, you're just adding steps to what should be a fairly straightforward interaction. Magic is also a bit half-baked, as you're only given 3 spell slots for each level of magic, and once a slot's filled, it's permanent. With a total of 4 potential spells for each level in both the black and white category, you always have to leave one behind. Being required to make a choice between potentially viable abilities is a great idea. In addition to personalizing your arsenal, it requires you to think ahead in how you'll utilize those spells. There's also no MP, instead magic's cast with charges, and each level has its own individual amount. This, coupled with the fact that the only recovery items are potions, it turns any particular jaunt into a survival game with a big focus on resource management. I love it in theory, but unfortunately a few issues prevent it from being a great addition. The game itself features no description for magic, so to figure out what anything does, you gotta sacrifice a permanent spell slot and test it for yourself. This would be fine if you could unlearn spells, that way you'd be free to fuck around within the system, but you can't. Again, you can find this information in the book, but it really should be in the game somewhere. Also, it's mostly wrong. Plenty of magics flat out don't work, or have unintended results. Both of the physical attack buffs don't work at all. A spell meant to negate elemental resistances can only be cast on the party, and there's one which is supposed to decrease enemy invasion, but does the opposite. Some of the shit that does work is also iffy, such as the instant kill spells, which most enemies are resistant to and only work when the target's almost dead anyway. The sleep ailment is bugged and always dispels after a single turn, you get the point. Those things on their own aren't too bad, but the fact that magic damage doesn't scale with intelligence is really what kills the whole system. It makes offensive magic overpowered at the beginning and pretty much useless about halfway through. Melee attacks are objectively superior for a couple reasons, primarily the fact that stats impact damage, but also with the critical hit bug and a spell called Fast, you can cap most bosses in a few hits. The aforementioned bug is one where the crit rate is pulled from a completely different table of numbers than intended. Because of this, weapons appearing earlier in the game have an almost non-existent chance to critical, where late game weapons hover just below 50%. Couple those mid to late game weapons with the Fast spell, which basically doubles your melee damage, and you're pretty much unstoppable. While some classes are put at a heavy disadvantage because of all this, and I'd argue that the Black Mage and Thief suffer the most, the fact that you have the freedom to craft your own party right off the bat is still fantastic. And even more so is the character sprites. The starting forms of each class are quite cutesy, with disproportionately large heads and stout limbs. At a certain point in the game, you're given the option to upgrade your classes, and this comes with a visual redesign, decreasing the size of the head, accentuating longer limbs, and displaying a more heroic stance. Given the harsh limitations on NES sprites, they did a fantastic job visually conveying their power increase, even if it doesn't change their stats at all, except for the monk who actually gets weaker. Yeah, and I couldn't think of a good segue, so let's talk combat. Upon loading Final Fantasy, one of the options resting on the title screen is a battle speed selector, and you want this fucker at 8 because anything less is suboptimal. Damage text will pop up insanely fast, but you'll also save hours of playtime, especially if you're using magic, as spells that target multiple enemies resolve individually. And as battles can contain up to 9 enemies in a single encounter, this gets tedious very fast, so speed up. It also aids in combat keeping your attention, which is quite important as there's no auto-direct for attacks, so if you target an enemy who dies before your turn executes, the game won't change targets, and you'll attack nothing. This could be seen as a negative thing, that you can't just mindlessly mash A to win every random encounter, but believe it or not, it makes combat engaging. It demands you pay attention to common enemies, sussing out their HP ranges, testing potential weaknesses, and knowing your own characters well enough to not piss away turns. You do want to optimize turns as well, because plenty of enemies come packing ailments, and they fucking hurt. Battles with a high enemy count can be lost quite easily, if they all smack you with stun or sleep, and if they happen to outspeed the party, you're pretty much fucked. Luckily, these aren't too common, but an ailment that is poison, and you've got to be well prepared for this as it can mince through your resources. The biggest issue with ailments that stick around after combat is that they automatically shift the afflicted to the back of the party. Due to the way formation works, where the front man is the bigger target, that means the top slots will more likely be shifted to the back on a successful poison attempt, ruining your formation. This would have been done as a way to alert the player, but having to heal the ailment as well as reposition your party every time it happens is just a waste of time. Attempts at idiot-proofing games shouldn't penalise people who are actively engaged and paying attention. Because of the prevalence of status effects and the immense amounts of enemies that can pop up in combat, bosses are typically easier to deal with than random mobs, as your focus is set on a single unit, and with how broken melee is, the big boys drop quite fast. They also don't feature gimmicks, like the closest thing is the elf, who has a high physical defense but crazily low magic defense and health, so the ideal strat for most bosses is hit hard and hit fast. Speaking of fast, when NPCs are bumped into, their movement speeds double to get them out of the way quicker. This should be a standard in tile-based games, but maps should also be designed so dickheads can't get stuck in the way. Final Fantasy is guilty of this, as there's a dungeon with a one-tile-wide corridor and free-roaming bats. The winged menaces can get stuck, requiring a lengthy RNG-based wait to move forward, and the worst part about it is that you have to visit twice because of stupid plot bullshit. A lot of the level design is geared toward multiple visits, and while you can breeze through most areas in a single go, there's incentive to treat your first expedition as a scouting mission. With optional branching paths that either lead to dead ends or treasure, putting aside a trip for the epic loot then returning with the knowledge of where everything is can be a smart approach. As I mentioned before, the first major dungeon, the Earth Cave, requires you to visit it twice. Once for a mini-boss, and then you've got to bugger off elsewhere to grab a MacGuffin to unlock the rest of it. The second proper dungeon, the Volcano, features plenty of short, straightforward paths that take you right to the boss, but they also feature optional side areas to explore. These are full of some pretty good gear, and it seems like the dimorphic design exists as a concession for a returning adventurer. Then there's the third big boy dungeon, the Sea Shrine, which functions as two dungeons in one, again contributing to the whole revisiting idea. Effectively, it's a big underwater tower, and your starting point's about halfway up. With a dungeon above and a boss below, you've got to scour both directions separately to acquire individual key items. As I said before, this can be done in a single visit, but by starting in the center of the tower, you're offered a chance to head out and heal up before you venture to the other part of the dungeon without too much backtracking. The penultimate dungeon is also two distinct areas, but there's no real stopping point between them. This is the only major one which defies the convention, as it's pretty straightforward and you can easily clear it in a single push, provided you have the key item to get to the second tier. So in addition to potentially requiring a second visit because you missed something, the dungeon also houses Adamantite, which can be used to create the second strongest weapon in the game. In every version I played, I'd always immediately leave the dungeon upon acquiring it just to get that sword. This is highly personal, but the incentive is definitely there as you get to clap the fourth fiend with an incredibly powerful weapon. The final dungeon is a tricky one because of the way forced encounter panels work and the fact that you can't leave it without a warp spell. Tiles which conjure a forced encounter are repeatable and can be stepped on as many times as a player desires. Throughout the dungeon, each of the four fiends appear on these tiles as a mandatory encounter, and it's required to slaughter all of them before tackling the final boss. This seems like one of those final stretches where you can do an initial run, clear the sub-bosses, and then return for an unimpeded sprint to the ultimate bad boy, but because forced encounter tiles never despawn, and the fact that you can't leave without a warp spell, it's simply not the case. The encounter tiles don't seem like a bug, and based on their appearance in every subsequent version, they're probably not, which begs the question, why? Up to this point, all the dungeons were fairly lenient with pacing progress and allowing for brief respite with minimal penalty, but the final dungeon pushes you to your absolute limits. It doesn't feature a heal or save point, probably because you're not supposed to feel comfortable, and the fact that you could softlock yourself if you don't have a warp spell. I don't think it's necessarily an issue, but the abandonment of that leniency is an odd choice from a dungeon I think would have benefited from pulling some punches. That's not to say it's difficult, just that it's a little bit tedious. There's another type of special tile, which I both love and hate, found within a handful of dungeons, and these are damage tiles. They pop up in the Volcano and Ice Cave, taking the form of lava and herdy ground ice respectively, and moving across them damages the party. I like the idea of these, as they typically penalise careless movement, or cover the flaws of shortcuts which cuts down traversal time, at a cost, but in Final Fantasy, walking on them is unavoidable. There are certain maps wherein the critical path is behind a shitload of damage panels, and I would hate this if not for the fact that encounters can't trigger on these tiles. I generally found it was worth booking it through as many of them as you can, and making up the health later, as you'd lose far less to the damage tiles than if a battle went tits up. One of the first maps in the Volcano features this idealized trade-off, where you can simply glide over a handful of damage tiles to hit the stairs, or you can brave a maze and deal with the random encounters. This is a fantastic way to use it, as that choice is put in the hands of the player. It's just a shame this principle wasn't more widespread. Something genuinely impressive for not only the time, but also the first entry into a series was the escalation of traversal and how the world's designed around it. Obviously, you start off on foot, but it's not too long before you acquire a ship. Sailing is initially limited to a small basin, and the ship can only dock at ports, so it's far from overwhelming and does a decent job at guidance through restrictions. Once you eventually move out into the open waters, you're still limited by where you can dock, so even though the world is quite expansive, it's never overwhelming. Then you'll be given the Canoe, which can travel up streams and rivers, something the boat can't do. The Canoe's implementation is brilliant, as not only can it be used from land, but it also serves as an unspoken upgrade to the ship, giving you the ability to dock at rivers. This opens up a lot more paths and makes exploration much more accessible. Eventually, you'll acquire the final vehicle, the Airship. My issue with airships in JRPGs is that they often trivialize exploration, since you can immediately zip wherever you need to go with minimal effort, and the experience feels less guided. Final Fantasy uses the map to give you the accessibility of flight without removing any of that adventurous feel, as most of the endgame areas are covered in deserts, forests, and swamp, which the airship can't land on. Typically, these areas feature a single grass tile far away from the point of interest, so the airship serves as a delivery device for more adventures, instead of dropping you at the front door of your next destination. When you can simply fly everywhere, you're given a good look at the world and its limits in their entirety, so it loses its mystique to a degree. However, due to some well thought out vehicle interactions and intelligent map design, Final Fantasy avoids this for the most part, and I fucking love it. Even if the walk speed is mind-numbingly slow and encounters are really annoying. And that's Final Fantasy on the NES. It's simple, it's clean, and the way that it's making me feel tonight, let's just say it's hard to let it go. But this video wouldn't be worth shit if I didn't talk about all the major iterations, so let's dive into the PlayStation release, the better half of Final Fantasy Origins. Final Fantasy Origins is the same game at its core, but introduces a lot of necessary improvements, most of which were lifted in their entirety from the WonderSwan version. I was going to include it in this video, as you can clearly see from the footage, but the PS1 version took all of the changes and added much more, such as flashy but unrelated FMVs. It also increased the resolution, except for a handful of small events which remained the same as the WonderSwan. Square being lazy with ports and remakes is not a recent thing. The improved feature list includes the ability to dash, rebindable buttons, a proper save function, general menu optimization, cursor memory, the ability to change the text speed, attack redirects, and a whole lot of other shit. Some of it can even be disabled for an authentic NES experience. The shops and equip screens now display stat changes, spells are given a brief description, and are no longer permanent as there's an option to unlearn them. The user interface is greatly improved all around, and items can also be bought in stacks, so most of my major issues with the NES version have been fixed to a reasonable degree. It does come with some bug fixes, but intelligence still doesn't affect magic damage, rendering casters effectively useless again. While the overall package is a vast improvement, it's also the beginning of the slippery slope into casualization, as it features an easy mode, which is quite frankly insulting. And NPCs were introduced in the opening town to guide you without your consent. Fucking disgusting. It's a minor complaint and is more than made up for with the bump to enemy health, meaning the bosses are actually a challenge, even with melee still being brutally overpowered. The fresh coat of paint recaptures the original experience almost perfectly and introduces a lot of fantastic improvements, and because of this, I'd say that Origins is the definitive version of Final Fantasy, even with the added load times. The full experience of the NES version's there, but with enhanced usability, and I think that's the best thing a remaster can do. Final Fantasy Origins gets a cancelled on Twitter, then brings receipts and makes a comeback. Out of 10. Final Fantasy Dawn of Souls again borrows from the WonderSwan version, but comes bearing a lot more changes to its detriment. The root of the issue is that it fell victim to the slippery slope of accessibility, and now the game is insultingly easy. Items cost less, experience and money pay out like a motherfucker, and encounters never pose a serious threat. You can also save anywhere, which I usually have no issue with, but it goes hand in hand with other elements to reject what the original Final Fantasy was about. The NES title, as well as Origins, were about being well prepared before setting off on a long, arduous adventure, where due to the heavy restriction of resources, you'd have to manage them carefully and fight against the ailments. Dawn of Souls is about walking through bad guys until the credits roll. With the complete bastardization of the faux survival elements, coupled with the changes to core mechanics, there's simply not enough content to comfortably factor in the new additions. Some series standards were introduced, such as Phoenix Downs, High Potions, and Ethers, for the MP system. The original charge-based magic was done away with and replaced with the standard MP system featured later in the series, but remnants do remain as spells still have levels and you're still limited to 3 of each. I'm not a fan of this change, and while I'm beyond chuffed that intelligent scaling was finally fixed, being able to cast spells carelessly due to a high MP count means that most forward motion is made with little thought. If you've taken some damage, you can cast Cure as many times as you need it, and you'll clear everything with ease. The difficulty of the previous titles was largely derived from low spell accessibility and bugger-all healing. There were items you could use to cast low-level healing spells in battle, but they weren't spammable, and it was pretty risky as it required living enemies. Being able to cast Cure as many times as you please outside of combat and supplementing it with high potions as well as ethers trivializes that process. This version is incredibly disappointing, and no amount of portability or extra dungeons can save it. Because the extra dungeons are also shit. They largely exist independent of narrative progression, which gives them little value as the content's abysmal and the rewards are unnecessary. There are 4 dungeons, one for each fiend, and they consist of 10 to 30 randomly assorted floors, which are made up of puzzles, movement obstacles, and random encounters. They're incredibly dull, and after a set amount of floors, you get to fight a boss from a future title, or a past future title. I love the addition of cameo boss fights, and some of them are quite well done, but the loot yield is generally better than what's in the base game, and with it being too easy already, it serves solely to trivialize the difficulty further. Honestly, these dungeons are worthless. They would genuinely benefit from just being a sequence of cool boss fights fought throughout a linear sequence of rooms. There was no attempt made to fit them into the rest of the game in a meaningful way, and they end up feeling like tacked on endgame content, which, funnily enough, is what they are. I'm not against adding new shit to old games, but at least make it enjoyable and attempt to integrate it into the core experience. Next meme! Final Fantasy 20th Anniversary Edition finally breaks from using the WonderSwan version as a base and uses the same assets but with a filter on them. Yeah, cool. I actually don't mind the look of them, and some of the added effect overlays are great. Rays of sunshine litter the skies of quaint towns, dark areas have a faded black circle around the edges, and that's about it, but it's a nice touch. The monster sprites have also been updated to more closely reflect Amano's concept art, and they look brilliant. There's nothing wrong with the original designs at all, but these sprites are so clean, I love them. Outside of that, the only other addition to my knowledge is the extra bonus dungeon, existing alongside the other 4 from Dawn of Souls. It still suffers the same issues as the other 4, but features a time theme. The super duper boss is locked behind a bunch of these trade-off maps in which you have to impose limitations on yourself for extra time to complete tasks and puzzles. It's a great idea, and some of the puzzles are fantastic, but the random encounter rate genuinely kills a lot of them. How you progress also determines which variant of the boss you'll get, and with 8 different versions, you've got to move through the dungeon 8 times in very specific ways to see them all, which is dumb. Most games aren't fun or engaging enough to justify moving through the same area 8 times, and this dungeon is no different. It's integrated into the story a bit more with a mysterious cloaked man in the starting town who leads you to the entrance, but there's no narrative involvement outside that. And that's it. I played through the entire game for this segment. It's one way to spend 20 hours, I guess. Well, I hope you got something out of the 30,000th review of this game, and I can't wait to talk about the second entry. It's gonna be something. As always, thanks for watching, and remember to take care of yourself, because I'm sure as fuck not gonna do it. Bye!